Mark just beat Conquest. Cecil said even Omni-Man would have lost that fight. So can current Mark survive Thragg? Season 3 finale Mark, the one who just walked away from Conquest, one round with the Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire. Can he make it out? The answer is yes, but the reason is probably not what you think. You need to understand who you're actually looking at before this conversation means anything. Correct. Thragg was engineered from birth to be the most powerful and most dangerous Viltrumite alive. Every resource the Empire had went into producing him. By the time he reached maturity, he had outpaced every other Viltrumite in physical ability and combat knowledge. That is what the Empire built him for. What the show has not fully revealed yet is that Thragg is also the Empire's architect. He kept the Scourge virus a secret. He designed the infiltration program that sent Nolan to Earth. He understood before anyone else that the Empire's survival after the Scourge required a different approach than open conquest. Physical dominance combined with that level of strategic thinking is what separates him from every other Viltrumite. Conquest is one of the oldest living Viltrumites, thousands of years of combat, so formidable that Cecil concluded Omni-Man would have lost to him. Mark may have beat him, but Thragg intimidates Conquest. A being who has been winning wars for millennia looks at Thragg and knows he does not want that problem. In the comics, when Mark and Nolan attack Thragg together during the Viltrumite War, Mark lands a hit and nothing happens. Thragg punches through Nolan's torso and chooses to let them both live. He spares them out of a calculation, not weakness. He decides they are more useful alive for the breeding program. That kind of heartless, pragmatic thinking is basically the most terrifying thing about him. He kills Battle Beast after days of fighting across an entire planet. The cost to him is one eye. He kills Thetis, founder of the Coalition, by ripping his head off mid-war. He eventually tears Mark completely in half, and that happens after Mark has gotten substantially stronger than he is right now. Season 4 is when the full picture arrives. The conversation about this fight almost always stops after Thragg and never gets into what Mark actually is at this point in the show. The Season 3 numbers are exact. 90 days of training, speed up 65%, endurance up 70%, strength up 138%. He more than doubled his strength output in 3 months. And then he spent the rest of Season 3 in actual combat, which for a Viltrumite compounds into permanent physical development in a way training alone cannot replicate. Watch the Reaniman sequence at the start of Season 3. 3 of those things gave Omni-Man genuine trouble. Mark moved through far more of them without losing pace. Current Mark is at or above his father in raw outputs when fully committed. The power scaling in this show has shifted and it is not going back. There is also something the numbers do not capture. Mark in Season 3 fights differently from Mark in Season 2. He creates openings instead of waiting for them. He reads movement and uses angles. He has been processing every fight and pulling lessons from the damage. That compounds every time he survives something. Nolan spent centuries getting to where he is. Mark is doing it in a fraction of the time. Thragg goes after the people around Mark deliberately in the comics. He targets Eve, he targets Terra. He knows Mark's attachments are both his biggest vulnerability and the thing that makes him most dangerous. When he exploits that, what comes back is not the version of Mark operating at baseline. Here is the part that is going to be uncomfortable. When Thragg arrives at full force in the comics, he tears Mark completely in half. One half in his hand, the other half on the ground. This doesn't happen to early series Mark. This happens well into the story, after the Viltrumite War, after years of additional combat experience. A significantly stronger Mark than the one we have right now. Thragg does it with ease. Mark survives only because of Adam Eve. When Eve is near death, her mental inhibitors break down and she can affect organic matter. She rebuilds Mark at the molecular level and he comes out stronger than he went in. Different density, different output. Mark notices it himself. Without that moment, the series ends there. The Mark who kills Thragg in the sun has been through the full Viltrumite War, been literally rebuilt by Eve, and is fighting a Thragg who has already been worn down by everything before the final fight. Even then, it barely goes his way. Mark drags them both into the sun because stellar plasma is the one environment where Thragg's healing factor gets outpaced. Robot sends armor mid-fight. Alan pulls Mark out before the sun finishes him. Thragg still breaks both Mark's arms before Mark bites his throat out. Barely a win, with every advantage aligned against a Thragg who has already been through a war. Every condition had to be true simultaneously. Remove anyone and the fight ends differently. Current Mark has none of them in place. Season 4, Thragg arrives fresh, full capacity, and the gap doesn't close just because Mark is growing fast. The strength comparison gets all the attention. But what makes Thragg genuinely impossible to fight is something else entirely. 5,000 years of combat does something to your ability to read an opponent that no training program can replicate. Thragg has fought thousands of species in thousands of environments against thousands of fighters who believed they had an angle. He has seen every approach. His responses are not calculated anymore. They are instincts built from so much repetition that thinking would actually slow him down. Mark has been fighting seriously for a few years. He is learning at an unusual rate. But the gap between a few years and 5,000 years is not something training percentages can close on their own. The experience layer is its own problem, separate from the strength problem. There is also no version of the opening exchange where Mark catches him off guard. He was trained from birth specifically to never underestimate. When he looks at Mark, he will see exactly what Mark is capable of and respond from the first moment. What Mark has that partially compensates is something Viltrumites are not supposed to have at all: human psychological flexibility. He improvises. He adapts in ways that rigidly trained beings do not. Nolan has some of this, but less, because he spent centuries in Viltrumite culture before Earth. Mark grew up human. His instincts are human. The final fight ends because of this. Thragg breaks both of Mark's arms, and Mark bites his throat out. A raw, human, last option act of will that was not in Thragg's pattern library anywhere. Viltrumites do not bite. Warriors do not abandon form to use their teeth. Thragg had no counter because nothing in 5,000 years of combat prepared him for it. That human unpredictability is the one category where Mark has something Thragg genuinely cannot train against. It does not make him likely to win right now, but it makes him dangerous in a way pure power comparisons miss. Think about what it means that the comics resolved the most powerful Viltrumite alive through a bite. They could have written any ending, but they went with the one where the finishing move is something a 5,000-year-old warrior genuinely did not see coming, not because his reflexes were too slow, but because his entire framework for combat never included it as a possibility. Mark's humanity is not a liability in the Invincible universe. In this specific fight, against this very specific opponent, it is the deciding variable. There is also the damage compounding. Viltrumites get stronger from what they survive. Every fight Mark has been in has made the next one marginally easier to get through. Every injury that healed closed a little differently, a little denser. The version of Mark who survived Angstrom Levy the first time was different from the one who walked in. The version who survived Conquest is different again. That process does not pause when the opponent is Thragg. The version of Mark who comes out of a first encounter with Thragg is already different from the one who went in. That is not a path to winning round one. It is a path to surviving long enough for a second round. Survival is the first requirement for everything that follows. Here is where the comics tell you something most show-only fans are not ready for. Season 4, viewers are going to expect a moment where Mark gets strong enough and wins. That is not how the comics do it. The arc toward the final confrontation is built on erosion. Thragg goes to Thraxa, builds a half Viltrumite army, fights a Battle Beast rematch he barely wins, and then faces the combined coalition and Mark's team in a war near Earth's sun. By the time he and Mark have their final fight, he has already given most of what he has to that war. The Grand Regent walking in fresh is not what Mark faces at the end. A being running on will and vengeance after giving everything to a war is. Like, Mark winning is not about a power upgrade, it is about Mark being the last piece standing after everything else has cost Thragg what it needed to cost him. Every fight along the way matters. Every alliance, every piece of damage that accumulates on Thragg before the end. The show has been building a world where consequences compound, and Thragg is where all of them are pointing. What this means for a show-only viewer is that the resolution of the Thragg problem is not a moment. It is the accumulation of everything that happens before it. The show has been rewarding patience across 3 seasons, The Thragg arc is where that patience pays off. Losing to Thragg and not surviving Thragg are two different things, and current Mark has specific things that matter at this level. He can take conquest tier damage and keep functioning. We watched him do it in season 3 multiple times. Like, staying present under damage that would end anyone else is not the same as matching Thragg, but it means he stays in the fight long enough for the people around him to act. In a fight with Thragg, that window is everything. There is also the emotional reserve. Showrunner Simon Rakiapa confirmed there is always 30 to 40% more available when Mark is fighting for the people he loves. Cecil's number is the floor. Thragg will push exactly the buttons that open that reserve because he goes after the people around Mark deliberately. He targets Eve, he targets Tara. When he does, what comes back is not baseline Mark, and Mark does not solve this problem alone. Alan gets dramatically stronger every time something close to kills him, which has already happened in the show. By the time the Viltrumite War arrives in the comics, Alan is operating at a level nobody predicted. Eve's full potential has not been tested. The show has revealed glimpses of what happens when her inhibitors come down and she stops limiting herself to non-organic matter. The comics version of Eve at full capacity is one of the most powerful things in the entire universe, not just on Earth. Robot is always building something designed specifically for Viltrumite vulnerabilities. These are not background characters. They are pieces of a system built to solve a problem no person could solve on their own. What season 3 established is that Mark is now strong enough to be the anchor of that system. He holds Thragg's attention and absorbs the damage while everything else is put into position. Without that anchor, none of the other pieces matter. The conquest fight also shows something beyond the power numbers. Mark chose to survive when everything in the situation was telling him to stop. That amount of will staying in the battle past the point where rational instinct says quit is what a fight with Thragg ultimately demands. Season 3 is the first time in the show that fully formed in him. This is the piece most breakdown skip, and it might be the one that actually decides whether Mark makes it out. Nolan and Thragg have unfinished business. In the comics, their final confrontation ends with Thragg winning and Nolan mortally wounded. Nolan survives just long enough to watch Mark become Emperor before he dies. The reason that moment hits as hard as it does is what it means for the fight itself. Nolan goes in knowing he is not going to win, holding Thragg's attention long enough, costing him anything, even if the cost to Nolan is everything, is what Mark needs to still be breathing at the end. The show has been laying every piece of this in place for 3 seasons. Nolan chose Mark over the Empire in season 1. Every season since has been him learning what that choice costs and deciding he is willing to pay it. The comics say he is. For season 3, Mark, Nolan in that fight changes the math. Thragg has to divide his focus. Nolan will not retreat. Every second Thragg spends on Nolan is a second Mark is still in the fight. This is not a fight Mark can survive alone. The question is whether he can survive it with the people around him. And for the first time in the show, it looks like that answer is yes. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the comics resolve the Nolan and Thragg relationship the way they do. Nolan does not get a redemption fight where he wins and validates his growth by beating the strongest thing in the universe. He gets a redemption fight where he goes in knowing the outcome and does it anyway. That is a different and harder kind of courage to write. The show has been setting up Nolan's emotional arc for 3 seasons for exactly this. The version of Nolan who lied to his family, who beat his son nearly to death, who left Earth and then came back, has been building toward a moment where he uses everything the Empire gave him to undo what the Empire built. The comics deliver on that fully. Round 1 straight fight, no preparation, no help. Mark loses badly. Thragg ends things before the other person processes that the fight has started. That is an honest reading of what the comics show and where the show is heading. What current Mark can do is stay in it long enough to matter. Take the damage and keep going. Make Thragg work harder than he expects to. Force it to go longer than Thragg wants. Come back for the next fight, harder to kill than he was in the last one. That is what Viltrumites do when they survive something they shouldn't have survived. He could not do that in Season 1. Omni-Man ended him in one exchange. In 1, he could not do it in Season 2. Anissa walked through him while barely even being slowed down. But the Mark who just survived Conquest, who came back from damage that should have finished him, who held together when every rational instinct said, stop, that Mark can survive a first encounter with Thragg. Season 3 is him getting strong enough to be in the room. Everything that follows is about what he does once he is there. The fight the show is building toward does not end with a power upgrade and a clean win. It ends with Mark becoming the person who can hold the center while everything else collapses toward a solution. Every version of Mark we have seen across 3 seasons has been a step toward that. And the ceiling has not been named yet. The story is not done building toward it. He survives, and every time he does, Thragg has a problem he did not have before. If you want to know exactly what is coming for Mark in Season 4, subscribe to stay tuned.